History. For the first time in the history of the Stanley Cup Final, a team came back from 3-0 after the first period. And more importantly, the Oilers are going back to Alberta for a best of 3 for the best trophy in all of sports. Sure, we all lost a few years from our lives in that game, but the Oilers are very much alive on today's edition of Locked On Oilers.
You are Locked On Oilers, your daily podcast on the Edmonton Oilers, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to this Victory Friday edition of Locked On Oilers. I am your host, Nick Zararis. This is my second Stanley Cup Final run as host of Locked On Oilers, and I want to thank everyone that is making Locked On Oilers their first listen of the day. Locked On Oilers is a part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Today's show is brought to you by our friends over at FanDuel. Right now, new FanDuel customers can get $200 in bonus bets if you win your first $5 bet. So, on today's edition of Locked On Oilers, we're going to start with the gumption, the conviction, the heart the Oilers showed to get back in and ultimately win this game. Our second segment, we're going to pivot to talking a little bit more about the flow of this game and what worked for them that was here that wasn't in game number 3. And then we'll tie a bow, setting the table for game number 5, which will be on Saturday night, hockey night in Canada, back up in Alberta. And I'll start out by saying that overtime was not fun. It was fun once the puck went in. I saw the referee pointing and I saw the light go on. But that was about as stressful a overtime as you're going to get. And I think a lot of the conjecture and a lot of my feelings right now stem from how dead the Oilers looked. And I don't know if it gets more dead than pulling your goalie at 3-0 after the first period, after having had to pull him in the previous game. And once again, Chris Knoblauch pushes the right button at the exact right time. And especially when it's come to the goalies over the last 2 playoff runs, he has been Johnny on the spot. And we talked about it with Armando on the crossover episode yesterday. As much as we're all ripping our hair out and jumping up and down and pacing back and forth in front of the TV, Chris Knoblauch's pretty stoic. He's pretty relaxed and he's pretty comfortable. And obviously, as a professional coach, you can't react the same way a fan does. That would be kind of a problem if you were acting the way I do in front of my TV as the head coach of a National Hockey League team. But at 3-0, you're not quite dead, but you're on life support. You know, the doctor's asking your family members if you have a DNR and what it's looking like there. But at 3-0, and remember, 2 power play goals from Florida, then the Lindell goal. At 3-0, it feels like you're dead, especially in the context of how Game 3 went, where you had it at 4-1 going into the third period, and you only needed 1 goal to make that a game. And it never came. It got out of hand. It was ugly. It was a butt kicking. You had 2 days to reset. And you came back out and you had a bad first period again. You had Kane take 2 penalties. You had Nurse take a penalty. The Panthers scored 2 power play goals. And of course, as many people wanted to tell me after game number 3, the referees, man, you can't complain about the referees. Well, they missed 2 penalties and they led directly to Florida goals. So the Oilers won, so we don't have to spend a lot of time on that. But don't tell me the referees don't play a role in the outcome of these games. Now, is it the Oilers' responsibility to worry about the officials? No, of course not. The Oilers need to play better than the referees officiate, which is what I have said the entire time. But alas, it's good vibes today. We won. We are not letting upset Panther fans rile me up today. More than anything, I can exhale. More than anything, it feels like the Oilers found something in themselves. And look, I want to be very clear. This is not how you draw it up. This is not the game script you draw up when you're talking about how you're going to go about winning the hockey game. You don't want to go down 3-0. The goals they scored were all kind of funky and ugly to varying degrees. Like that Nurse goal has no business going in. The Wallman goal is extreme patience to get that puck to him. And Bob probably could have gotten over if he plays it a little cleaner. But like, this was a very funky hockey game. The goals Florida scores, we're talking about screens, traffic. We're talking about chaos in and around the net front at both ends. And the Oilers deserve all of the credit in the world for not only winning this game, but for showing that they have something in themselves. And I think a lot of people expected this to be what the third period looked like in game number 3. Yeah, the Oilers were down 4-1 and they were getting frustrated that the officiating wasn't very good and that they felt Florida was having their way with them and it got out of hand. They took a bunch of penalties, the fights, whatever. But tonight, they felt they had to lock in. They had to focus. And they showed some genuine and impressive resolve. They showed not just that they are a good hockey team, but that they are resourceful, that they will not be pushed around, and most importantly, Florida is fallible. I made the allusion after game number 1 when Draisaitl scored very early on in game number 1, first 2-3 minutes of the game. I made the comparison to Rocky getting Drago to bleed in Rocky 4, but that's kind of what this feels like because Florida is so good. Florida's got one of the best 1-9s in the history of the Stanley Cup, in the history of the salary cap era, I should say, which dates to 2005. This is one of the deepest forward groups we're ever going to see. And maybe that changes going forward with a higher salary cap. Teams can afford to have better forward groups. But this Florida team is so talented. They play a really simple, a very effective style. And the Oilers, to their credit, fought back. They made this game go their way, and it wasn't pretty. It wasn't easy. You broke out your break in case of emergencies. You brought Troy Stetcher back in. He didn't play a lot third period and overtime. You brought Jeff Skinner in, who had some nice moments on the forecheck, had one really good offensive scoring chance, ultimately didn't convert. He was in the crease on the Trent Frederick chance in overtime. He had as good a chance as Frederick did to score there, but I think the fact, and I'll wrap up on this note, the fact that the Oilers gave up the goal at the end of regulation with like 20 seconds left and still were able to collect themselves, still able to focus, take the 20 minutes for the intermission, come back out and reassess. And that overtime was not pretty. The post Florida had, you saw Pickard all over the place. And look, I understand Skinner and Pickard are not what we would call elite goalies. Frankly, I don't know if they're even what we would call good goalies. Pickard and Skinner, the way they play goalie is nerve-wracking. It is body parts flailing. It does not look that way when guys like Bobrovsky do it. It just doesn't. And look, Bob's a world-class athlete. He's a little bit taller, but the Oilers got out of that overtime and they won one on the road in Florida. They scored 5 goals. You have to feel like Rocky did when he finally got Drago to bleed. This is not winning the fight. This is not winning the series. But you are going back to Alberta, best of 3. You got 2 at your rink, 1 back in Sunrise over the course of the next week and a half. Game 7, should we get there, would be next Friday. There is plenty of time for deliberations, for conversations. But right now, if you are an Oilers fan, you are entitled to a deep breath. I know if you're listening to this on your way to work on a Friday morning, on the way to school, at the gym, or if you're a sicko like me on your run in the morning, savor this. Because this is the type of game you will talk about for the rest of your life. You will talk about the way the Oilers came back and won game number 4 of the 2025 Stanley Cup Finals for the rest of your life. This is going to be burned into your memory, and you'll think about how awful Darnell Nurse was in this game until he scored that goal. You'll think about how Skinner was pretty mediocre in that first period. You'll think about how it felt like getting stabbed in the chest when Florida scored that goal with 20 seconds left in regulation. And you'll think about the reaction you had when you saw the referee point at the net and the red light go on in overtime, because moments like that do not come around often. First time in the history of the Stanley Cup Final, a team down 3-0 after the first period comes back and wins the game. Anytime you are doing something for the first time in the history of the Stanley Cup, you're doing something special. We are going to take our first break on today's edition of Locked On Oilers. When we come back, I'm going to explain a little more in depth what tactically and strategically the Oilers did tonight, a little bit better than they did in Game 3, why they were able to score a little bit more, and a whole lot more on this edition of Locked On Oilers, where we've got your team covered every day. The NBA Finals and Stanley Cup Finals are both in full swing, and every game delivers highlight-worthy performances, major momentum shifts, and epic moments. Whether it's overtime game-winning goals or massive upset wins, there has never been a better time to get in on the action. And FanDuel has made it so easy to stay in the game before tip-off and puck drop and after the game starts. With player props, performance trends, and same-game parlays, fans have more ways than ever to play smart and win big. So if you're itching and you think the Oilers are going to go up 3-2 on Saturday night, are you going to ride with Connor McDavid 1.5 shots on goal? Are you going to ride with Evan Bouchard shots on goal? Or if you're a hating Florida fan and you're here to watch and see me gloat after how miserable I was the last 2 days, and you want to say Sam Reinhart's going to score, or maybe Sasha Barkov, or Matthew Tkachuk, who had 2 tonight, or if you're over in the association and you think Shea and the Thunder are going to get going again, maybe that's your play. If you're new to FanDuel, there's never been a better time to sign up. If you head on over to FanDuel.com right now and place your first $5 bet, you'll get $200 in bonus bets. Make every moment more with FanDuel, an official sports betting partner of the NBA. Thank you to everyone who is hanging out on this Game 4 of the Stanley Cup Final Victory Friday. And don't you forget it. You have earned this after sitting through that mess that was Game 3. To be here right now, to have this feeling, you got to savor these moments. And these are the types of games that are steeped in the mythology. These are the types of games that when we're having Draisaitl Hall of Fame conversations 10, 15 years from now, and he will be a Hockey Hall of Famer. He's arguably already the best player in the history of mainland Europe, if you don't include Russia. And I know that's a touchy subject. You know, Russia's technically part of Europe when you're in a certain part, and Pavel Bure. And don't get me wrong, Russia's produced a ton of great hockey players. You know, the Sedins in Sweden, Lundqvist, Alfredsson, Lidstrom, so many great players over the years. But Leon will undoubtedly be a Hockey Hall of Famer someday. And that goal, that'll be in the montage when they induct him in the Hall of Fame. And you don't make moments like that out of thin air. And the Oilers, to their credit, as they looked down, dead, and buried, started to get going. And like I said in the first segment, and I'm going to expand on it, this is not how you draw it up. These are some ugly goals. And obviously, when you're having a hard time scoring, as the Oilers had through the previous 4 periods, first period of this game, and then game number 3, at a certain point, it becomes a matter of simplifying. What can we do to get pucks on net, to make Bob move around, to make the Florida defenseman move around? And you get a stinky goal in there, the way you did the Nurse goal. You score on the power play with the Nugent-Hopkins goal. And Nuge did a tremendous job setting up the one goal in the third period, setting up the Wallman goal, It took me a minute to remember which one. He makes that play behind the net. He forces that puck to the middle. They get it over to Wallman, who's set up for the biggest one-timer imaginable. And Bob didn't have a great angle. He was going post to post, and Wallman scores there, gives them the lead with 6-7 minutes to go. And you can exhale. And you know Florida's good. Florida's going to generate some dangerous offense down the final minutes of that game. I know they nitpicked the Kulak turnover there that ultimately sets up the game-tying goal for Florida for almost the entire 20 minutes of the intermission report down here on TNT. But the biggest difference for me in this game as opposed to game 3, number one, the Oilers got some bounces. You need some stinkers sometimes to get going, and you're not going to get those all the time, especially against a goalie as good as Bob. But sometimes you need a little bit of that to go your way, and momentum is not measurable, but you can feel it. Momentum is all around you when you're watching a game. All it takes is a couple good sequences together, and all of a sudden you start going downhill a little bit. All of a sudden, you start thinking, well, if we can do this, we can score 1. We can score 2. If we score 2, then we're only down 1. And you start to believe. And I'm going to quote the Shawshank Redemption again. I tweeted it before, but I'll say it again. Hope's a dangerous thing. It'll drive a man insane, but you got to believe. When you're one of those guys sitting on the bench down 3-0, going into the locker room at 3-0, and I'll be very curious to see if we actually find out any real details about what was said during that intermission. But McDavid gave the great speech in Game 4 last year, where the dig-in speech in the Stanley Cup Final, and I'd be reticent to say the Oilers, they bucked up tonight. They showed you what they are capable of. And it came in unconventional manner. You got goals from Nuge, who's having a good playoffs, Nurse, who was having a horrendous game until he scored, the Podkolzin goal, which was an ugly one down low, banging away on a loose puck. And real quick, as an aside, I love the way Podkolzin plays. He's never going to be a 30-goal guy. He's never going to be an 80-point guy. But that dude is a hockey player, and that is not insightful analysis. That is not deep. But that guy plays in such a determined and energetic way that it is infectious. It creates that downhill feeling, that snowball feeling. And he got going as this. And that's one of the benefits of having guys like him and Kapanen who only play 12, 13 minutes a game. They got a lot of juice. They're more than excited for the times they do get their number called. They get to jump over the boards, go out there and make a play. And Podkolzin has continuously this season found himself in the right place at the right time. And that's the reward for doing your job. And to quote anybody who ever played a sport growing up, every single one of us has heard this from a coach at some point. It's one of the oldest cliches in the book, but luck is what happens when preparation meets opportunity. You do the right thing over and over and over again over the course of your shifts. Eventually, the puck's going to find you in a good spot. And Podkolzin, who has been plugging away this playoffs, he has been doing his job as a forechecker and as a puck retriever. He got rewarded. It is the simplest thing in the world. You want to make something happen, you got to go to the net. You're going to eat a stick. You're going to eat a cross check. You probably are going to feel uncomfortable doing it, but you go to the net over and over and over again. You put pressure on defensemen. You put pressure on the goalies. Eventually, you start to get rewarded. And the Oilers showed you resolve. They showed you guts. And after Game 3, with everyone in the world questioning their fortitude and if Florida owned them, the Oilers showed themselves that they can dig from anywhere. I kept thinking of the Paul Kariya, the off the floor on the boards. The Oilers were under the floor. They were under the floor after the first period. And they showed just how dangerous they can be. And they can do it easily. The goals they scored tonight are not easy. And that's going to nicely set up what we're going to talk about in our final segment today, talking about the series going forward and how the Oilers can win this thing, win 2 of the next 3, win your first Stanley Cup in 30 years, 35 years, and put this Florida monster to bed. We are taking our second final break of today's edition of Locked On Oilers. Be sure to stick around. We've got your team covered every day. Did you just realize your business needs to hire someone like yesterday? How can you find amazing candidates fast? Easy. Just use Indeed. When it comes to hiring, Indeed is all you need. Stop struggling to get your job post seen on other sites. Indeed sponsored jobs put your post at the top of the page and help you reach the right candidates fast. We've all been in that spot where our team needs the right hire, like yesterday. The pressure's on. And every day without the right person is a setback to not only you, but to your entire team. And that's exactly when Indeed sponsored jobs come in handy. They make sure your post is seen by the right candidates right now. And now you can speed up your hiring process with a $75 sponsored job credit. Just go to Indeed.com/lockedon right now and support our show by saying you heard about Indeed on this podcast. Terms and conditions apply. Hiring, Indeed is all you need. Thank you to everyone who is hanging out on this Victory Friday of Game 4 of the Stanley Cup Final edition of Locked On Oilers. And man, it's days like today I wish I smoked cigarettes. And I don't know if I'm allowed to say that or not on the podcast. I might get in trouble for saying that. We'll see if I get an email. But that was an insane hockey game. The group chats, the Twitter chats, everybody losing their mind. Just that is what you dream of as a neutral fan. Rooting for the Oilers, that was hellacious. That was miserable until they won. And then it was one of the best hockey games I've ever seen in my entire life. But man, I wish it was easy. But of course, if it were easy, it wouldn't be the best trophy in sports. It wouldn't have this much meaning. It wouldn't feel this way if it were easy. Yeah, I know a lot of people were excitedly Oilers in 5, Oilers in 6. Still could be Oilers in 6, but like, you gotta understand the moment here. This is one of the great Stanley Cup finals of all time already, and we've only played 4 games. Sure, could the last 2, 3 be stinkers, have blowouts sprinkled back and forth? Sure. But this is some of the best hockey I have ever watched. And tonight, the Oilers were able to capitalize on some Florida mistakes. They were able to break up some passes. They were able to put a little more heat on Bob. And that's really the key. And for large stretches of this game, the Oilers were just having a hard time getting going. They couldn't establish the offensive zone. They couldn't get the cycle going. They were skating a lot. They were covering a lot of ground, and they were playing a lot of defense. And that's not where you want to be. You know, I've likened playing Florida when they're going downhill to trying to wrestle a boa constrictor or to fight against quicksand or a riptide, because the harder you try against it, the more you're going to tire yourself out and the more you're going to make mistakes. You know, that's what went wrong in game number 3. The Oilers tried to make a bunch of plays outside of structure and they got worn down and broke down, and it created a terrible, terrible feedback loop that put them down the way they were and why they ultimately snapped and lost the game. But now you got that behind you. We have to address the goalie thing, and obviously, I'll do an episode for Saturday as well, because I do want to talk about the game more and the series at large more, because there's just so much to talk about. But having the conviction to go to your backup goalie in that spot, it's not for the faint of heart. And you used your last bag of trick. You used your last real piece in your bag of tricks there. I don't know if you can realistically go back to Stuart Skinner unless there is an injury or if Pickard's getting blown out. I don't think you can start Skinner. I frankly don't think you can go to Skinner here and try and get him to screw it back on. And to be fair, I only think the third Florida goal, the one that towards the end of the first period, that's the only one I really felt he probably should have had. And the penalty kill has been god awful for the entire playoffs, not just this series. But it is hard for me to envision a world where they will go back to Skinner. It is hard for me to envision a world where we'll see Troy Stecher again. I imagine John Klingberg will draw back in for game number 5. Jeff Skinner versus Victor Arvidsson, I think the difference is negligible. I think Knobloch probably trusts Arvidsson a little bit more and could play him with guys in the top 6 if he really felt he needed to. He did that during stretches of the regular season when the team was playing well. I don't think we would see Jeff Skinner up. And I think something that really sunk into me tonight is without Zach Hyman, Nugent-Hopkins becomes so much more essential. And Nuge had a really good game tonight. He scored the 1 goal, and he ultimately helped facilitate the Wallman goal with the play he made behind the net. And when you're missing a piece like Hyman, who is so important, led the playoffs in goals last year. He had 11 points in 15 games these playoffs before he suffered the wrist injury. When you have a guy of that caliber and you cannot play them because of injury, you need pieces to step up in the aggregate. And we talked about that earlier, and we talked about that going into the Stanley Cup Final, the Moneyball approach of you can't replace Zach Hyman, but recreate him in the aggregate between Kapanen and Arvidsson and Jeff Skinner. You have gotten some functional hockey. I thought Connor Brown had a lot of jump in his game tonight. I thought he was skating really well out there as a forechecker and making some things happen for himself in the neutral zone. I thought the Panthers did a pretty good job of containing Connor in this game. He had some flashes. He had one really nice breakaway look that that Bobrovsky ultimately had saved. But the Oilers played a decent hockey game tonight. And that's not really a high bar to clear, but you got good underlying results. And a lot of these line combinations are pretty chunky because they only played 6-7 minutes with each other, but they had enough. And some of them struggled a little bit more than others, and some of them played better than others. But most importantly, you scored a bunch at 5-on-5 tonight. You scoring the goals they did at 5-on-5 gave you a chance to win this game. And as much as I want to bemoan the penalty kill being awful and the power play not being as good as it was last year, ultimately 75 to 80% of the game is played at even strength. And if you can keep it close at even strength, and I'm not saying you need to dominate, but if you're within 55-45 in the scoring metrics, in shots, in high danger chances, expected goals, shots on, if you're within 55-45, you have enough leeway there where your star players like Connor, like Leon, like Evan Bouchard can make things happen for you. And I thought playing Kulak with Bouchard was the right call. Bouchard and Kulak played pretty well together tonight. I like that they have the option there. I like that when they had offensive zone starts, they went with Wallman and Bouchard. I think that's an underutilized pair. I think, frankly, that's something I would like to see a little bit more of, especially in offensive zone starts when they're going to be out there with McDavid, especially on the road where they're not going to have last change. So to wrap up today's show and go into the weekend on the right note, as the ring light on my camera died there, but you got to feel really good right now. And there's so much work to still go. The old poem, The Miles to Go Before I Sleep, I think that's Robert Frost. It's been a while since I was in 10th grade English, but you win a game like that, you prove something to yourself and to everyone else, and you give yourself some breathing room, and you put yourself in a position to win the Stanley Cup. And that's the goal here. It's not to go up 3-2. It is to win the Stanley Cup. 2 out of the next 3. That's not a crazy ask. I know Florida's good. I know Florida's arguably the most talented team of the Cap era. The Oilers can do this. They've already beat them twice. 2 more times. 2 out of the next 3. Not a crazy ask. That'll do it for today's edition of Locked On Oilers. Be sure to subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. If you're on Apple or Spotify, please leave the show a 5-star review. If you're watching over on YouTube, hit that subscribe button, hit that alarm bell so you get notifications whenever new content goes live. Hit the like button, please. It would be nice. I'd appreciate it. And be sure to check out Locked On NHL and Locked On NHL Game Night over on the Locked On NHL feed to revel in the Oilers win a little bit more. I will talk to you guys tomorrow. Until then, let's go Oilers.